Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Hilaritas Podcast, where we explore the vast world of iconic writer, psychedelic psychologist, rebel philosopher, and self-proclaimed agnostic mystic, Robert Anton Wilson. Hilaritas Press has just released a new edition of the long out-of-print classic Terra II by Timothy Leary. In appreciation of this release, I have 2 episodes lined up for you. Next month, we'll release my chat with Terra II co-transmitter Wayne Benner. But right here, right now, it is my great pleasure to share with you my chat with sound engineer and international man of mystery, Fritz. Fritz, welcome back to the Hilaritas Podcast.
Thank you. Thanks for having me back.
Yeah, so I was excited that you took the role of writing the introduction to Terra II, and I didn't realize it was Tom Jackson that suggested you. And I didn't realize you were a Leary aficionado for some reason. I'm not sure why that didn't register with me, but has that just been, I think of Rog or Jeff Crowley, but for some reason.
No, I was extremely influenced by Leary from reading The Cosmic Trigger as much as any of those other people, Gurdjieff, Crowley, etc., John Lilly. And I was just completely thrilled and I feel very grateful that I was able to write this introduction. I probably have the same, I kind of, when I come across these figures that just really resonate with me, like Crowley, I develop a small obsession toward them at first. And Leary was the same way. Just tried to track down everything he wrote. And I was kind of even more into his philosophy than Crowley's at first, and that. And I'd go hear him talk when I had the chance when I moved to New York. Got to speak with him one-on-one briefly a couple of times, once before a talk and once after, and just had some kind of what do you call it? One connection of people removed from him. Like, for instance, my friends Glenn and Lee Perry, who made the Samadhi flotation tank company. They were the first ones. They worked with John Lilly to design a commercial flotation tank, the first one. When Leary was getting ready to pass in the 90s, John Lilly asked them to go down to his place and to install a flotation tank for him. So that he could use that to prepare for his passing. And so they did. And so I got a little report of what he was like then, from Glenn and Lee. And he's just been a major influential figure on me.
I can relate. I also relate to the small obsession that you get when you tune into somebody. I have a similar pattern.
Right.
Well, where should we start here? Terra II, what do you think? You start off discussing escape. I don't know if that's where you want to head here, but.
Well, I think I'll start with, it is escape, I think, is one of the main themes. I think Leary used that as a way to get out of his situation. That's one of the remarkable things about that book. And one of the reasons I was grateful to do the introduction, because I got to do all this research and find out what the context of it was. And he was in the worst position imaginable. I mean, he had really pissed off the authorities by escaping, and they brought him back and, put him on trial, for his escape trial while he'd been on the run. He was on the run for just a little over 2 years. They indicted him. They indicted him on 19 additional counts connected with the Brotherhood of Eternal Love, So he was even in more trouble than just escaping. And so, his lawyer told him at the escape trial that he was free to say whatever he wanted. He could be as crazy as he wanted because, I mean, it was incontrovertible that he had escaped. There was no question that he was going to try to get, a way out of that. So he just said stuff like, I am the reincarnation of Socrates or whatever. And he went on to explain that. So they ended up sending him to Folsom and putting him into solitary confinement beside Charlie Manson. And not only that, it's researching it, like the authorities were trying to mess him up severely. Like Wayne Benner feels that they were trying to get him killed. It's almost like he was a political enemy, but they didn't want to cross the line and kill them himself. They wanted it to be done, for them. So they put him into Folsom, and they figured that one of the gangs that he would join, one of the gangs, and that the rival gangs would get pissed off and off him. So that's how Wayne Benner got brought into the picture. For those who might not know this, Terra II, what we're talking about, is credited as having been written by Leary, Wayne Benner, Leary's partner at the time, Joanna Leary, and Benner's partner at the time, who we only know her first name. It was Sigrid. In the book, she's known as guanine, if I'm pronouncing that right. That's one of the 4 basic amino acids in DNA. So Wayne Benner comes into the picture because Leary made friends with this jailhouse lawyer named Robert Hyde, and they realized the situation was dangerous for Leary, and somehow Benner was one of these people who was able to talk to all these different factions: the Aryan Brotherhood, the Black Panthers, the Hells Angels, all these different gangs, and he got them to all agree that if Leary stayed neutral, they wouldn't harass him, or he wouldn't, get killed. And so because of that, Benner and Leary started talking. And this is, to me, one of the most incredible coincidences, synchronicities, or whatever, because they start talking about stuff like panspermia, which is the theory that the building blocks of life originated in outer space. Now, they're in Folsom Prison. Wayne Benner is not a highly educated person in terms of, I mean, he may be so, but he's an autodidact. He wasn't educated in college or anything like that. All his education came from the massive amount of reading he did in incarceration, because he went to jail at a very young age, I think maybe 19 or something like that. And at some point, he got turned on to reading, and that was a way out. That was an escape for him. So escape is one of the big themes. It's multi-level theme because, I mean, when they're writing this book, their heads aren't in their immediate circumstances. They're out, trying to figure out what's going on with this starseed transmission. So
I'm curious, escape at this point for me almost feels like a distraction. Like, it's important to note that he had been in prison, and when you talk about, there was something that hit home for me years ago, and I think it was Leary that said this, is that when he was in Algeria on the run under the supervision of the Black Panthers, he realized he was just a prisoner again, but a prisoner of Eldridge Cleaver, because they wanted to manipulate him for their own gain, and he couldn't, he was just limited in his freedom with them. He could only do so many things. And then he moved on, and was it the French arms dealer, or maybe Swiss, Michel Hartard? And
yeah.
it was the same situation. He was just a prisoner of Michel, who was trying to leverage him for power and influence and all that. So it was like even when he was on the run, he was still a prisoner. And so there is, I guess I'm rambling, but the idea that there is a fixation on escape, but to me, it's kind of like just something to be aware of, and that really there's a bigger story here.
Oh
Uh,
yes, there is a bigger story. I mean, he literally had to escape from Eldridge Cleaver. It's in flashbacks how him and
okay.
Rosemary managed to get out. Then they escaped from Cleaver, but then they had to figure out another way to escape from Algeria because they had gone into a main town in Algeria, and the Algerian government wanted them to stay and all this stuff. So yeah, so the escape theme, it's for them personally, but they also felt that humans on Earth needed to escape from their robotic lifestyle, from their
Mm,
bondage, from their incessant, war making and all the problems and all that stuff. So it's Terra II is framed as I mean, it was being used as a distraction for themselves, but I mean, it's a mind-blowing distraction when you read it. And one of the I'm really glad Hilaritas is putting it out because to me it was kind of like a skip in Leary's biography. It wasn't well known. I mean, it was when it was originally published, there was only 1,000 copies made. And if you look at like the biographers of Leary, they just kind of like skip over that part of it. Robert Greenfield, John Higgs. It was almost like I'm pretty sure they hadn't read Terra II because they're making assumptions that are erroneous.
mm,
For instance, I mean, surprisingly, Higgs is very unkind to Leary during this time. He says that's the craziest period in his life, that the ideas are bizarre,
uh,
that this was all, one of the things that plays into the sort of revelation of Starseed is the appearance, the sighting of a comet that was named Kahutek, and
right.
that was supposed to come and supposed to be a big bright thing in the sky, and then it turned out not to be so. But Higgs's interpretation is that it was very egotistical on Leary's part, that Kahutek was a sign that he had changed humanity and that it was going to come to free him personally, Leary. That's written in I Have America Surrounded. I'm not sure where that comes from, but if you read Terra II, and I don't know if have you read it,
Yeah,
Terra.
yeah,
Yeah, so it's not egotistical at all. I mean, I don't.
right.
I mean, because he Leary credits like the whole basis of it to Wayne Benner, and it might very well have been like Wayne Benner was very interested in all these cosmic ideas and extraterrestrial intelligence and all this stuff. So that's one
Yeah.
thing that's going to clear the record. There's another. I'm not sure if it came from Greenfield, but it's stated that Leary said that the transmissions came from aliens in outer space, from extraterrestrials. He never makes that claim in Terra 2. He's never saying that he's talking to some alien intelligence or whatever. I mean, he says how it comes about. And interestingly, okay, so getting back to the blip on his biographical record, he doesn't mention it in flashbacks. There's like one paragraph, one small paragraph in flashbacks, which is Leary's autobiography. Joanna Leary, who's one of the co-authors credited as, barely mentions it in her memoir. And Are You Serious, who wrote a very good biography of Leary, just has one paragraph about the comet. So it's not very well known. It's unique in Leary's work because it's right around this time that he's developing the eighth circuit model of consciousness. And and also, so he's known, all his writings up until that point have to do with raising consciousness with psychedelics. And then he
Mm,
kind of shifts into the eighth circuit model. Well, Terra 2, it's got zero mentions of drugs at all, which is, considering where he's writing from and the fact that he's trying to get out of jail because of what he said about drugs makes perfect sense. it also doesn't talk about the eight circuit model at all, even though that was like on the burner for him at the time. So, and he never, subsequent to his release and all that, he never went back to it and promoted it. It was never reprinted. It wasn't, it never became part of what they call the Future History series, which was, books like Neurologic and Exopsychology and The Game of Life. But anyway, the interesting part also to me is that it was framed as a receptive, the starseed. So anyway, just to back up, Terra II is an interpretation of the starseed transmissions. They're separate things. So they receive this communication from we don't know where. He doesn't really say where. And then the interpretation of that was Terra II. Terra II is the realization of the starseed transmissions. The best biographical information on it is Robert Anton Wilson in The Cosmic Trigger. But if people, if you're going back and you're in the future, like if you're 2,000 years ahead and you're studying the 20th century philosophers, you wouldn't think to find out about Leary through The Cosmic Trigger or whatever. It's not billed as a biography on Leary, but the best information is in there. Like the even more, so the question of what were these transmissions? Where did they come from? And Leary gives an outline of how it worked inside Terra II, but basically that I got the feeling he wasn't revealing everything about it. He says that they would go out on the yard. They had 1 hour a day on the yard, and he would ask Wayne Benner questions. And then the next day when they saw each other, Wayne Benner would provide his answers or whatever. And then Leary would take that and write it. And Leary, he models it after the occult alchemist, scientist, map maker John Dee and his partner Edward Kelly, which was around the time of the beginning of the 17th century in the early 1600s, the time of Queen Elizabeth I. And also, I don't know if I'm rambling also, but so anyway, I believe I have a theory that Leary didn't play it up much after. He didn't mention it hardly at all in flashbacks because he's a scientist and it doesn't comport with the scientific view to receiving communications from, higher intelligence, whatever that is.
Well, I'll let you take a breath there because I want to bring something up. And what struck me, it's interesting. This is exactly where I wanted to go because it's like he's very, there's not a lot of clarity on where this is coming from and what it's all about in terms of the transmissions. But what hit me was that this really falls in line with the high weirdness thing that Eric Davis goes into, that you've got Philip K. Dick, Robert Anton Wilson, and Terence McKenna having these unusual experiences in the early to mid 70s. And here's Leary having kind of this, it feels like it's in the same vein. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, but it's just a lot of strange things going on.
Yeah, I do have thoughts on that. And I haven't reviewed high weirdness for a while, but I know that I remember that Eric Davis was disparaging towards Leary about that in that book. He says that Leary was obsessed with Crowley. I can remember it because it's footnote 77 and my name Oz adds up to 77. That's how I remember these things. And I was like, why is he obsessed with Crowley? And at that time I went and read the whole starseed thing, and Crowley is not mentioned at all in Terra II, as you know.
Right.
It's John Dee. John Dee was an important figure in Crowley's thing too. But anyway, high weirdness also, it's in the Robert Anton Wilson chapter, and my interpretation of that was that he was trying to. I mean, Eric Davis is always open-ended, and he's never asserting a dogma or anything, but it was presented as more of an academic presentation. I think it was academic, and then he put it into popular form. Um, but it kind of reduces Wilson's experiences to psychology and sociology, to what was going on with him personally, and to what were the signs of the times. Now, myself, I am an occultist, so I can accept that there can be such weirdnesses as higher intelligences and all that. But so Wilson compares. Oh, okay. Let me get back to the timing of it. You mentioned it's a remarkable coincidence because the Terra II, the starseed transmissions occurred in August of 1973, according to Wilson. It was July 22nd of 1973 when Wilson did his experiment that the next day, July 23rd, resulted in him being told that Sirius is very important. And that kicked off his whole research into, was he in touch with intelligences from Sirius? And so it was right around the same time. It was exactly the same time. And Wilson says that he got flashes of Leary, telepathic flashes of Leary leaping over Folsom prison walls. They were supposedly
Yeah.
telepathic experiments. Um, so Wilson there's more clarity, and it could be, I mean, who knows what's true or not, but in Cosmic Trigger, he writes a little bit more about how these transmissions occurred, a little bit more than Leary does in the occult sense, like exactly what the transmissions were. Wilson says that they discussed them all between the four of them and came up that it was in not really, it wasn't, given to them in straight ahead English. They were given these communications and they had to decipher them. But anyway, Wilson compares the received transmission of Starseed with the received transmission of Crowley's Book of the Law.
Ah, right.
And because he says that, the Book of the Law appears in language Crowley would use, and Starseed kind of appears in the language Leary would use. But they took remarkably different courses, where Crowley ignored the Book of the Law for 5 years, and then he found it in his place in Scotland while looking for a pair of skis. And then he decided, for whatever reason, that was his life's mission. And he spent the rest of his life proselytizing the Book of the Law and incorporating it into everything he did. Leary does the sort of exact opposite, never really mentions it again. By the time he's out of jail, the whole Terra II model has kind of transformed into high orbital mini Earths. I just want to say, for anyone who doesn't know what we're talking about, Terra II is a book about an idea of building a small city spaceship that's going to have a crew of 5,000 that's going to go toward the center of the galaxy. And it's Terra 2 because Terra 1 is the Earth. So they want to take an Earth-like environment, put it on and, onto a spaceship and put it into outer space.
Yeah, so I would add just that it's almost like a biosphere to where they want it to be a living, breathing, organic
Yeah.
matrix, I'll say, and then staffing it, so to speak, with, like scientists, philosophers, the best and the brightest, so to speak. It had that kind of put our smartest people on this thing and let's send it to, we would say, the heart of the universe, which was also like the center of intelligence, is the way it read, as I remember.
Right. I think it's very interesting because it's very well planned out, the idea of Terra 2. I would put Terra 2 in the category of utopian books,
Mm.
like it started, the word was coined by Thomas More in the 1500s. He wrote about the ideal, I haven't read it, but it's an island called Utopia, where our, ideal society occurs and all that stuff. And this seems to be what Terra II is aiming at also, like a way to, um, you know, solve the world's problems by putting everything toward a common aim.
Mm.
And but he really, it wasn't just like a science fiction fantasy. It's kind of right on the border of science, speculative science, and science fiction. Like it crosses over into science fiction. It is, I would say, technically science fiction because they had no, I'm not going to say they had no idea. They did have ideas, but there was no clear technology on how this was going to work, on how the, propulsion system. That's one of the chapters that's covered in Terra 2, these prospective ways that it could come about. But they were really, it says that right in Terra 2, that they're hoping for major engineering breakthroughs to occur. But in leading up to that, he has the plan is extremely well established with, what they call convocations in Japan, and how it would invite these scientists. And he tried to get a number of scientists on board with this, like Carl Sagan is probably the most well known. Carl Sagan was, he was at the what they call SETI, the search for
Mm.
extraterrestrial intelligence. So he was sympathetic. Um, and yeah, so they were, but the idea of utopia, the word comes from the Greek roots of it mean no place. So this utopia, it's not like it's acknowledged that it's fiction. It's more like a blueprint for how things could be. And so I don't, he never really literally tried to make it happen after he got out of jail. And of course, he couldn't really, he was pretty constrained by being in jail, and most of their energies were directed toward getting out of jail. And it took 3.5 years by the time he was recaptured before he did get out. And Wayne Benner took on the role of in Folsom of helping all these other prisoners out, telling them what their rights were, etc. And he writes in his autobiography called Seven Shadows, that he noticed that whenever he started interacting with a certain prisoner and helping them, that they would get transferred,
Mm.
so that he couldn't help them anymore. And this happened with Leary. Leary ended up getting transferred to Vacaville, and Benner suspects that was because he was starting to draw too much attention. Like Carl Sagan was going to go visit Leary in Folsom. He ended up not visiting him until he made it to Vacaville. But anyway, the authorities were they were still messing with Leary. They were still trying to get him killed. They sent him to other prisons and gave him the name Charlie Thrush. Thrush is a songbird, someone who, squeals
Snakes.
on people. And that was the big rumor in the counterculture at that time, that Leary was informing on people like the Weather Underground and all this stuff. It's still controversial. But anyway, the effect, even though Terra 2, it didn't obviously have a literal outcome, but it kind of pushed the envelope a little bit. There was this project called the Biosphere 2 in the 90s, where they tried to seal off a part of the Earth to see if people, if you could create a Earth environment that was not connected to the planet. That experiment had its ups and downs, but it was, probably based on Terra 2, or Terra 2 influenced it, as did the writings of Buckminster Fuller. So it had other effects. It space migration, intelligence increase,
Right.
extension, which is all that's like kind of the main theme in Terra 2. The SMILE formula isn't ever directly mentioned. Um, as I said, Leary credits that to Benner with coming up with that. But that was what Leary, that was his biggest push at that period of time.
Would you
Uh,
say at this point that was his introduction of Smile? That was the first time he really started talking about it?
yes.
Yeah.
Um, it's also, yeah. So Leary, so one of the examples of, or one of the lessons in Terra 2 is how to take an incredibly horrible situation and flip it, make it the best possible. Leary calls that period the most intellectually productive period of his life. The eight circuit model, I mean, it might have came about anyway, but it literally came about because he was incarcerated. In flashbacks, he talks about it beginning when he was in Switzerland. He was on the run, but he got arrested by the Swiss authorities because the U.S. was trying to extradite him. And he says that when he was in the jail, I mean, he was under the uh, protection or support of that Swiss basically criminal Michel Houchard, or I forget the pronunciation of his name, that guy. He sent in all this stuff, like all this, bottles of wine and great food and coffee and cigarettes. But it was also a typewriter and lots of paper to type with, like everything, like his own little hermitage with the luxuries. And so he said he started, he says, and I don't know where and when this happened, but he had run across someone named Lama Govinda who had told him that he should study the correlations between the I Ching, the Tarot, and the periodic table of elements. So he
Mm.
said that he worked 10 to 12 hours a day in this Swiss jail coming up with these thoughts. I believe, as far as I know, that's the beginning of the eight circuit model. And then the next manifestation of it is when he's recaptured and brought back and put in, before his escape trial, he's put into the solitary confinement in San Luis Obispo prison. Um, and he's only given legal briefs, but on the back of a legal brief, he writes neurologic. And as far as I know, neurologic is the first formal formulation of the eight circuit model. And, so then it just keeps going from there. It all came about because or I don't know if it because, but as a result of him being locked up and not being able to do anything else. I mean, Leary, he loved to party. He was a very social guy. And so it could have been that he needed that, that's how he framed it in Terra 2, that it's like it's not the worst jail in California. It's a Benedictine monastery.
Ah.
That they're um, providing a service by distracting them from all everything else in life, so they can just work on their projects. He compared the yard, like when they would go out and talk on the yard, he compared that to the Plato's Academy in Athens, where these philosophers would get out. And so it really is an incredible lesson on how to, you think you're in a bad situation. Well, what can you do with it? I mean, that's, Leary showed that. But there were good things, a lot of good things that came out of it, even though, space migration still hasn't really happened yet. Um, Higgs speculates that Elon Musk must have read Terra 2. He writes
Mm.
that in the introduction to the Starseed Signals book, the Wilson book that came out.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
um, and so that was written in 2012. That was before Elon Musk went right wing and all that stuff. But when he was, you know, wanting to send, colonize Mars, basically. It had an effect, in that sense. It had an effect on, like, it changed Wayne Benner's life for the good. Another interesting coincidence is that after Leary got transferred out of Folsom to Vacaville, they wouldn't let them communicate, Leary and Benner. And so they came up with a plan, or they wouldn't let Joanna go and visit Benner, but they came up with a plan that a friend of Joanna's would be placed on Leary's guest list at Vacaville, and the same friend was placed on Benner's um, visitor list in Folsom, so they were able to communicate through this woman. Now, I don't know what her name was, but when Benner did get released, and I'm not clear exactly why he got released. He got released not so long after that, but he had also, as you know, he had talked with Leary about his economic ideas. And Leary had told him it wasn't really, wouldn't have a place in Terra II, but he should really talk to Robert Anton Wilson about that. So they corresponded. And then when Benner was released from Folsom, he was given the stipulation that he had to leave California within 24 hours. Benner is like he has like kind of I don't want to say a charmed life, because the beginning of it obviously wasn't charmed. It was the exact opposite. But he had a lot of like serendipitous things happen to him. And one of them was that in jail, one of the people he helped out in jail was like a jewel thief who was well connected and well off. And this guy was very grateful when Benner got out when he was released. The guy had asked Benner for his measurements, his physical measurements, and there were two beautifully tailored suits for him when he got out. And there was a limo for him to take him to the airport, courtesy of this prisoner he'd helped. And Benner decided that he wasn't going to go immediately to the airport, and he got the driver to take him to Berkeley to visit this same woman that had been visiting him in jail, that was like a conduit from Leary, because apparently you have to read between the lines a little bit, but they had developed an emotional attachment. So he went to go visit her. Coincidentally enough, she lived in the same building as Robert Anton Wilson.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah. And so they're talking, and she said, well, Robert Anton Wilson lives here. Do you want to go meet him? And oh, yeah, of course. So she takes Benner to meet Wilson, and they sit and rap for 3 hours. And he tells them in person about his ideas. As you know, Wilson wrote about them in his essay called The Rich Economy, published in the Illuminati Papers. But anyway, this same woman, Benner, they got involved, they got married, and Benner credits her with why he never went back to crime, with why he got like, it's unclear. His autobiography kind of ends shortly after he gets out of jail, what he did, but it seems like he went on to have, a more or less successful life. I know you interview him, so I know you know all this, but not everybody does. He's
a little bit, yeah,
like 80 or something. And I think at the end of your interview, he mentioned having several children with PhDs. So he obviously had, he's obviously still a philosopher, still trying to come up with ideas that are going to help.
Still very sharp mentally too, yeah.
So it completely changed his life, meeting Leary.
Right. And I guess this is sort of a related note, but I'm curious, you wrote a part in your introduction, and maybe I'm embellishing, but something about the book itself is a magical act, or maybe the writing of the book is a magical act.
Yeah. So that's another interesting thing in the timing of all this. It's happening right at the time that Wilson is having his intense experiences that lead to the serious research, which involves pretty intense experiments from Aleister Crowley. Now, Leary had been turned on to Crowley like a few months before, like not that long before, by a guy named Brian Barrett, when he was
Oh, right.
on the run or whatever, and they'd had a very strong experience in the desert outside in Algeria that was very, they figured it was the same place where Crowley had done some of his intense Enochian invocations. It might have been even the same place where he invoked Koranazan. So anyway, Leary or Crowley is very much in the picture with Leary at this point. There's a clip of him on YouTube saying he believed he was carrying on Crowley's work. Um, Wilson was way more into Crowley. With Leary, it seems like this might have been a phase he went through. But this was a phase that was going on right at the time that they wrote Terra II. And when you read it, it's very much love under will. Like they have a will to do this thing, but there's a few sentences in there where it's going to be coming from, love and harmony, and he realizes that putting 5,000 people in space, that there are going to be tensions and psychological dynamics that are going to have to be dealt with, and so he proposes solutions for that. And we find out, when they did the Biosphere 2 experiment, which I think was in Texas or Arizona, that exactly happened, that the people inside the place had, tensions amongst each other. But the magical act I'm referring to is that they were literally trying to change the world. I mean, this is like everyone get together, have these convocations in Japan, find all the scientists, all the people who want to be involved. They had ideas about how it would be funded. And this is like, obviously, it can't occur if all these countries are at war with each other. And, so it's kind of that's kind of the magical act I was talking about
Excellent.
trying to change the world.
Yeah, there's a certain amount of idealism in the book, but it's also like this is something to aspire to and aim towards, kind of.
Right, a blueprint.
There you go.
So I really think it's an incredible service that Hilaritas is doing by publishing this for several reasons. One, it fills in a little bit of a hole in Leary's story, but also, we don't know what's going to happen ahead. Crowley predicted 500 years of a dark ages just based on history. We might be entering that now. I don't know. Hopefully not. But it's obvious that Terra 2 or anything like it isn't going to happen in the near future. But it's being carried forward. The light is, if these are dark times, if the American election doesn't go very well, it could be darker. But this blueprint, this intelligence is being, it's not getting lost. So it's
What would you say for you is the major takeaway, like with this blueprint? Not the nitty-gritty details of boarding a spaceship to the center of the galaxy, but like to the extent that he's trying to create a bigger, brighter, more optimistic, more hopeful future. And maybe that's for me just the main takeaway in a nutshell, but I'm curious what you get out of it.
Yeah, the optimism is one of the takeaways. The optimism, where they call it a real energy at the end of Cosmic Trigger, was what turned me on so much to Timothy Leary. But one of the main takeaways for me is intelligence increase, because they say in there that the whole space migration thing and life extension hinges upon intelligence increase. So that's something, anybody can do right now from right where they're sitting now, is increase their intelligence, which, to me, that's like raising your consciousness. So that's kind of the takeaway from me. I mean, I like utopian stories. I really loved Island by Aldous Huxley, because they, it's obviously fictional. It's obviously, literally not going to happen, but there's things in there that you can take away from that to make your own life better, or make you realize how beautiful life is, or whatever it is. The thing that influenced me personally from Leary was the whole optimism thing of just when things are really down, think that they could get better, that this is a real energy that can be tapped into. And yeah, to me, it's very much tied into to Cosmic Trigger one, to the Leary stuff and that.
I'm gonna change my background to
I,
Wild and
I have that comic script.
Crazy Tim here, but and I'll
Yeah.
go use this to just go on my own little ramble here. But when I was thinking about this book, as I mentioned to you on email a while back, it was like it brought me back to I'm going to paraphrase from Joseph Campbell, but he was just saying, Joseph Campbell, as a mythology expert, was basically saying that all our myths are outdated as our modern culture. We don't have any good myths. And I want to say he suggested we look to science fiction for the new myths. And that's where, to me, this is Timothy trying to create his own myth for the future. And what got me is a few days ago, I was thinking about this podcast as we're starting to record, and a few days ago I listened to a podcast this guy named Tyler Cowen that actually Tom Jackson really enjoys, and he was interviewing Philip Ball, who is a psychology philosopher type, and he started talking about myth. And he started talking about how it takes kind of 50 years for a modern myth to install itself. And the current myths that he saw were Batman, which I don't think we can go into for right now, but zombies, and specifically zombie apocalypse, and AI apocalypse. And you started out, we're talking about escape from a robotic lifestyle. And I think that's kind of the theme of intelligence increase. So I contrast that with kind of modern myths around zombie apocalypse, which to me is like saying how we're all kind of the sleeping people and we need to escape from that robotic lifestyle. That's the way to avoid the zombie apocalypse. And in my own perspective, and even maybe the same thing for AI apocalypse, it's all about escaping from the roboticness. And Leary here provides this map for intelligence increase and how to escape from the robotic lifestyle. Um, anyway, that was kind of my thoughts on the book as I was looking over it and contextualizing it in this kind of where does this fall in the mythopoetic landscape, so to speak.
Yeah, I would completely agree with that. I think Leary, I think Wilson also, that we're trying to create new myths to for us to raise ourselves out of the morass we're in. Um, Science fiction, I think I replied on that email that I've had a lot of influence by a guy named E.J. Gold, who is the
Right.
H.L. Gold, who is one of the um, they were called the Big Three science fiction editors in the 1950s. He ran a magazine called Galaxy, which helped establish the career of like Isaac Asimov, Robert Heinlein, all these science fiction writers. Um, but I believe, but so anyway, on Gold runs an esoteric, or I don't say he runs it, but he's the center of an esoteric school, and on their reading list, it's like largely science fiction stuff. Uh,
Hmm.
Spacing on the author's name right now, but one of the big books is called "The Stars, My Destination." So that's, that was written in the 50s, and that's exactly Leary's myth in Terra II. But they, yeah, And then you can get back to like James Joyce was using old myths to try to create new myths, I think. So yeah, I very much agree with that. It's kind of like you gotta, bootstrap yourself up by conceiving of a better reality and then figuring out how to get there. And you might not get to the exact one that you conceive of, but you at least, you're able to survive the, what's going on right now.
Awesome. Was there anything else that you wanted to cover today that we didn't get to here?
Um,
I'm not sure. I wrote one of my notes was something about a sense of humor. Uh, you mentioned that. That goes with maybe the optimism.
yeah, that goes with the optimism. It's a real tool when you just get completely crushed by something, if you're able to laugh at it. One of the big, highly recommended things on the EJ Gold esoteric list is Marx Brothers films.
Mm.
Gold is also a stand-up comedian. He had us do write our own stand-up acts at one point. So yeah, humor. I mean, and Leary used that to great effect to get through. Um, yeah, I would just say that Leary really emphasize the positive, that he never really goes into how bad it was for him in Folsom. You can hear it from other stories, like for instance, Allen Ginsberg was coming to visit. It might not have been Folsom, it might have been after Folsom, but they just before the visit they took him and they shaved his head, and they purposely cut his head so he looked like a mental character when that he was just trying to make him look bad in front of his friends, all kinds of stuff. If you read Benner's biography, the treatment that he got in jail is just horrific. um, so Leary is going through all this resistance at the time he's trying to project the utmost positive utopian future. um, just yeah, what was going against him, the resistance he faced in trying to get his message out is just astounding. Oh yeah, I remember I was going to say Joanna Leary. She wrote an excellent memoir. I guess it's out of print now. It's something Hilaritas might bring back. It's called Tripping the Bardo with Timothy Leary, My Psychedelic Love Story. And she really believes that they messed him up with chemicals, with psychiatric drugs, that they were trying to break Leary. And there is one, he mentions one time that they gave him a bunch of something called thorazine. She felt that they had succeeded in fundamentally changing him, that they had messed with his mind so much. But she's also biased, I believe, because she had worked for 3.5 years. She loved the guy, and then when they came out, they broke up like 2 months later or whatever. So for her, I guess he did fundamentally change in the fact that he was no longer wanting her to be his partner. Um, anyway, my take on that is that I did, like I said, speak with Leary a couple of times in 1990, and like they broke him, I mean, he must have been just amazing before, because he seemed extremely sharp at the talks and bright and all that. And it kind of blew my mind because he was talking about higher states of consciousness, like more cosmic type things. And he made this comment. He says the only way I know how to get there is psychedelic drugs. And to me, that was just amazing that after all he went through, he was willing to say that in public again. But
Right.
he just passed over it. But he never stopped trying to change the world. One of the things I talked to him afterwards, and I asked him, how can I get a job like you have? When he gave me this real quizzical look, and he said, I don't know, but if you find out, let me know.
Let me know. Yeah.
Yeah, and then he just gave me this like, "What are you talking about?" kind of look, and I said, like I mean, like a cheerleader for change, that kind of thing.
Mm.
And this was in 1990, before computers were everywhere. And the first thing he said to me was, "Do you have a?" This is when they were just starting. He says, "Do you have a computer? Do you have a personal computer?"
Yeah.
Did, and so that was his, the next thing after drugs. That was going to be what was going to help advance intelligence. So yeah, he's one of my all-time heroes. I realized he was flawed. Um, one of his probably greatest flaws was in his relationship with his children. He was pretty much estranged from his son Jack at the end of his life. His daughter Susan committed suicide. They were messed up. So this is a little bit of a tangent, but I'm a big Frank Zappa fan. And Frank Zappa's eldest daughter, Moon Zappa, just wrote a book or just released a book called From Earth to Moon, which is about her life growing up in the Zappa household. And one of the questions she asks is, working with genius worth it, worth the resultant effects on the people around them? Like her family was geared around completely, like Zappa was a workaholic. She describes it as a pyramid with Zappa at the top, and everyone else was there to serve him, to serve his work. And so she didn't have a regular family upbringing. And I've seen that these are people. Zappa, EJ Gold, it was like that a little bit too, where the work is just so important, and then you have all these kids around, and you're trying to do both. I think Gold got on a good balance of that, but it was like, it's like what that question of, you know, is uh, is genius worth um, the toll it takes on those around him, and that would be a question for Leary, for Leary's life. Like he kind of, put less attention on raising good children and more about on changing the world and doing.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting thread of thought there. I'm unclear on the details, but I want to say the two children were from his first marriage, which was back when he was kind of living a more straight life.
Yeah.
And then I believe his wife committed suicide as well. And then he discovered psychedelics, and then he went on this his own personal roller coaster. I can only imagine what it would be like to be one of his children, and
Right.
being drawn into that whole circus of a lifestyle that he ended up uh, going through. Um,
Right. But he didn't, Alan Watts is the same way too. Like he had kids too that, and I think at one point he writes, well, I gave him this incarnation. What else do you want me to do? Type of thing. But Larry did not abandon his kids at all. I mean, he definitely tried. He when he was on the run in Switzerland, the daughter Susan got into some kind of trouble or whatever with her husband, and so he gave her money to come over and live with them, and she lived with him over in Switzerland. He tried to like help her out, and the guy, Larry wasn't like earning regular money. He got a windfall from Michel Houchard to write a book, which
right.
most of the money was, of course, scammed from him, but he did get some money to work with, and he did, he brought his daughter Susan over to help her out. So it wasn't like he was a complete like, you're on your own kids type of thing. I remember I heard the last time I heard Leary talk was just a month or two after the daughter had killed herself, and it was he discussed it. It was a very poignant moment. He said he didn't see the use of going down into a black hole of grief about it, but he acknowledged it, and you could feel, I mean, as genius as he was also a human that had,
Yeah.
human emotional responses.
Nice.
And
Yeah,
also,
they're all human. Go ahead.
oh, I was just, the eight circuit model came out of that period. That's gone on. I mean, I know you yourself have been, you know, taking it into different directions and stuff. So that's a legacy from that same period of time of Terra II.
Yeah, it's interesting how they both kind of sprung out of that same creative period in prison.
Yeah.
Um, yeah. And I just the children, the wrap up the children thought there. I think I'm fuzzy on the details, but I know Zach Leary is a stepson, basically that he adopted more or less. That the
Yeah.
Zach's mom left Leary, but Zach stayed.
Right.
So
I think Zach might still have something to do with the Leary archives. I guess I've heard it's in a state of disarray. I don't know. I know I have friends musician friends who are friends with Zach Leary, um, for whatever that's worth.
I believe the approval for Terra 2 came through Zach to Rasa, but I don't know
Oh,
much more detail than that.
oh, great.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, all right. Well, Oz, is there anything else? What are you working on these days?
I am working on a book called Music, Magic, and the Game of Life: Confessions of a Sound Engineer.
Wow.
Yeah.
That
Uh,
sounds like a big project. Is that a autobiography of sorts or?
Of sorts, it's a memoir. I call it. It combines my music industry war stories with my philosophy. So the game of life aspect of it is in homage to Leary's book, The Game of Life. My sound engineering company is called High Velocity, which I got from the Game of Life book in 1985. Um, and it's yeah, I've got like 12 chapters written. I have a bunch of stories I've already posted in my blog. That's why I started a blog at one point, is to start writing down these stories. And I realized a lot of it has to do with a very talented musician producer named Bill Laswell in New York, who had a whole network. I called it a school. He was very influential, but people really don't know about him. There's a drummer named Ginger Baker. He used to be the drummer for
Wow.
Cream. He brought Ginger Baker out of retirement at the behest of John Lydon, the former Johnny Rotten. Lydon asked him to get Baker as a drummer. Baker wasn't responding to any communication, so Bill went over to Italy. Baker was living on an olive farm. He had bought an olive farm. He was escaping because he was a heroin addict, and he was cleaning up by doing that, and brought Ginger Baker back, and that revived Ginger Baker's career. But there was a whole network of people that, like, starting around the time of the pandemic, started passing and dying, and I'm kind of wanting, and I had my own little kind of, I won't call it a brush with mortality, but I got bit by a brown recluse spider earlier this summer, and it wouldn't heal all properly, and I had to go get ultrasounds and stuff like that, and they were telling me I could have a blood clot that could move up into my heart and all this stuff. So it made me contemplate my own mortality, and I just want to get my book done and get it out before.
Very cool.
Yeah.
You I know enough about, well, one, I can only imagine the stories you've told or have to tell, but two, you've been around, but you look great. I mean, is it the floating?
Okay, well, it's partly the floating. It's partly, so this is something that's covered in Terra too. This is one of the themes, is time dilation. Time dilation is where time, it comes from Einstein's special theory of relativity, that the rate of passage of time is dependent on position and the speed of the observer, the frame of reference of the observer. So if Terra II goes towards the middle of the
Right.
galaxy, and there's a really cool it's very like a little confusing to me when you just try to think about it, but there's an excellent diagram in Terra 2 that kind of shows what's going to happen. I was really glad Raza put that in there. But anyway, I decided, and Aleister Crowley has an essay in one of his collected works. It's one of his earlier essays about why we're conditioned to base time on the movement of the earth and all this stuff, that it's sort of more Newtonian, that it's locked in to what happens in our own, this reference.
Right.
But if you start to consider time, the effects of time dilation, I believe that, so it's, the passage of time is based on the consciousness of, or the frame of reference of the observer. So in my theory is that you can slow down the rate of passage of time, that so they still don't know biologically why we age and why we die, but there's something that says DNA triggers the breakdown of the bodily processes and all that. And I think that if you can speed up your consciousness, that creates a form of time dilation in your body,
Mm.
if that makes any sense.
I'm so what I would get is that while we conceive of time as pretty fixed, it's actually relative.
Exactly.
And what you're saying is that if you're what did you just said it, so I've already forgotten the phrase, but by speeding up your consciousness, you're slowing down time, your own
Yeah,
physical time, physical aging.
yeah. I've seen, experience of that where time didn't behave like it was supposed to, where,
Right.
like a lot of, and people experience this also in sort of liminal states of sleep where they're not really awake or asleep. You might wake up and then doze back off, and you have this incredible dream or whatever. You wake up and you think like you've just been doing all this stuff, and 10 minutes has gone by on the clock or whatever. I've had
Right.
while waking too, well, like you're doing all this stuff and it's only been 5 minutes. Here's an interesting anecdote, which is the very first time I heard Robert Anton Wilson speak at the Open Center in New York. After the first hour or two or whatever, he took a break, and myself and my wife at the time, we went. There was a big freight elevator, and when we got on it, it was just me and her on one end, and Wilson was on the other side of it. And she asked me what I thought about it, my wife, and I said, well, it really felt like time was dilating, that there had been some time dilation. In other words, that more than 2 hours had gone by. I'd felt like I'd been there for a really long time. Time is stretched out. And I wasn't meaning to speak loudly or anything, but I noticed, I looked over at Wilson and he was giving me a really intense look when I mentioned time dilation. So, as you may have known, or people who have read Cosmic Trigger, he's told that time is also a very important thing to study in there. And then he says a lot of the weird synchronicities he experienced were displacements of time or had something to do with time. Leary was very much, this sort of difference in time passage was a big theme in his work. He ends his autobiography, Flashback, the last sentence is, it's about time. He
Hmm.
said something, the kids are doing something or whatever, and then it says, it's about time, which is a pun, it can be.
Right, right.
William S. Burroughs, I just wrote a blog on his book called The Western Lands, and he ends it, please, with the British last call for alcohol thing, which is, hurry up, please, it's time. And so this whole time thing is part of it. Um,
Is there
I've
something? Go ahead.
Well,
Sorry.
another anecdote, there's sometimes you get some strange things happening when you're working around EJ Gold, and one of the ones I experienced was um, walking. I was in the recording studio in his, it's a barn that's his painting studio. One corner of it is a recording studio. So I walked out of there to go into the house for lunch, and he was there painting. And I just walked straight out into the house, and he was there in the house. Like I would have seen him walk past or whatever,
Right.
but I didn't. One explanation of that is that if he is able to dilate time, he's able to go there before I get there. Like I'm in a regular rate of time. I see him and I go in, and like possibly by the time I got to the door, if someone's able to dilate time, they're able to walk into the house and is anyway. So
It is. Yeah.
other weirdnesses. So because um, one of the gifts of Wilson and Cosmic Trigger is trying to explain these things through science, through quantum physics, etc. And it's not an acceptable explanation that people can disappear and pop up over there or whatever. There should be, as a materialist, some scientific explanation, like, you walk into an alternate universe, which parallel universes are still a thing in theoretical physics. It's not completely science fiction. There are still scientists who are making experiments in that, not a majority. But anyway, so I think all this paranormal stuff can be tied to scientific explanations or materialistic explanations. They're just not just people happening to be magicians or whatever.
Right. Is there a particular practice that you've done specific to longevity, or has that just been sort of a side effect of your own personal spiritual practice towards increasing consciousness?
Only that I do want to live a long time. There's a lot I want to get done, even if it's just sitting and reading a lot or whatever, so I take care of myself. I exercise. Nothing. I write that in my introduction when there's an interview with a guy about longevity. It's just mainly common sense things like eat healthy, have a good attitude. I think the optimism factors into
Mm.
that. Um, you know, it's pretty well known, and I'm not advocating anything at all, but that psychedelics create an effect of time dilation, and
Yeah.
you can read about that. Wilson made a comment that when he saw, I don't know if it was in prison or whatever, but he hadn't seen Leary for like 10 years or something. He had seen him in the early 60s, and then 10 years later, he saw him again. And he said Leary looked much younger than he had before. And this is Leary was going through all his heavy psychedelic experimentation. So, you know, I'll let
Well,
people draw their own conclusions.
well, what I heard for you is that there is an intention to live long.
Yes.
And I don't know if I've done this publicly so much, but through this podcast in particular, the question that continually comes up for me is what is magic? And there's something about intention, if nothing else. So by setting that intention in the back of your mind to live a long time, I don't want to say maybe that's all it takes, but that feeds into the rest of your intentional acts. And here you
Well,
are looking like you're 45 years old.
oh, thank you. I just turned 65. Thank you.
Nice.
It's a Crowleyan tautology. Every intentional act is a magical act.
Right.
Almost they're similar, or they're the same. Yeah, the intention is there. Um, I think, yeah, I mean, I love what I do. I think that helps with it
Yeah, yeah.
because I still have to earn money making music. it's so strange to me. Like all my main sources of my income streams like ended like 2 years ago. Bill Laswell has been having health issues. I used to get regular work from him. The studio I worked out all the time had to close. All these things just serendipitously. I get calls from, European clients I work with to do stuff, and um, I don't know. It's just staying vital. It's staying, having a purpose in life. Like I said, I was extremely grateful to be doing this and to be doing the work that I help out with Hilaritas with. Like I'm really
Yeah.
proud to be a part of this team. Yeah, I think it's just like you look at people like longevity. You look at the Rolling Stones. Those I was going to say MFs are like they're in their 80s and they're touring and they're doing concerts. And Keith Richards, I mean, the guy did not set out to live a healthy lifestyle, obviously. What keeps him? Music. The music is just so intrinsic. And you have other guys. BB King lived a really long time. Bob Dylan is still out there. I mean, his voice is pretty much completely shot a little bit, but he's still doing it. The guy's also the same age, still touring. Like touring is not easy to do at any age when you do it all the time. And I think it's just having a purpose, an intention, and just being in love with something so much. So you just got to do it. It was said that Gurdjieff, when he died, and I think they did an autopsy on him, but the doctor said that he should have been like dead 7 or 10 years previously by how bad the guy Gurdjieff was not health conscious. I mean, nobody was back then, but Gurdjieff drank a lot, and they weren't being particularly healthy. I think if you have something to live for, I think that really is a big, big thing. And yeah, whatever it is.
Purpose. Got it. Well, on that mention of time, Oz, I want to appreciate and thank you for your time and your effort on writing the introduction there, and
Yeah, you're very
appreciate
welcome.
having you on.
Thank you for setting up this interview, and I hope everyone is inspired to get a copy of Terra II and read it.
Yeah, it's a fun one.
Yeah.
All right.
Until next time.
All right. Thank you for listening. Thank you to Oz for taking the time to chat. Thank you, as always, to the Robert Anton Wilson Trust. And thank you to Richard Rassa of Hilaritas Press for editing and production. My next episode with Wayne Benner will release as usual on the 23rd of November. Until then, I am your host, Mike Gathers, signing off with love and cheerfulness. Amor et Hilaritas. Hilaritas.